Tara, what do you make of these last-ditch efforts to undermine the election?
I think these efforts are unfortunate. You obviously don't want this sort of effort happening during polling time, during the day of the election. Having said that, when we look at the things to watch out for this election cycle, we want to look at voter intimidation. We want to look for misinformation from domestic and foreign sources. And then we want to look at violence instigation. So you have intimidation, misinformation, and instigation. And fortunately, we're here now on the East Coast. It's 5 p.m. Eastern, and there have been some isolated incidents of robocalls in battleground states. But looking broadly at the country writ large, I think so far so good in terms of voter intimidation. We haven't seen anything really at the polls. We haven't seen any violence, threats of violence. We haven't seen anything wide scale. So given all the concerns going into today, I think on that front, we're okay. So what we really need to pay attention to now is sort of the misinformation domain, which is still at play, and the violence instigation domain, which I'd argue will be in play until this election is complete, final, and confirmed.
My sources at some of these tech companies, Facebook and Twitter, are telling me they are mostly concerned about what happens after the election, the possibility of civil unrest. What is the likelihood we see violence, we see civil unrest in the streets?
I think the likelihood is actually quite high, particularly if we're in any sort of protracted and contested situation. I actually think you could see violence in all three scenarios: a Trump victory, a Biden victory, and a protracted contested situation. The FBI was on Capitol Hill during the threat assessment, and you had Director Wray testifying about groups on both sides, the extreme left and the extreme right, both sides of the aisle, far extreme groups. They have been tracking these groups, and they have seen threats to the election. This is a time where there's going to be a lot of uncertainty. There's not just the election in the next few weeks, but there's, the COVID pandemic. There's other things going on that create a perfect storm. And the country is extremely, extremely polarized right now. So I think you'll see all these factors come together. Having said that, while the probability of violence, I'd argue, is quite high, I always like to point out we have agency in how these things unfold. Leaders have the ability to lower the heat. We have the ability, the media, to provide and make sure that accurate information is getting out. Leaders on both sides of the aisle, the Senate, the House, Director Wray, Bill Barr, all these individuals over the next few weeks should be out there. They should be out there tonight, tomorrow, the next day, and they should be making sure that they are not only calling for calm on their own side of the aisle and the other, but they should also be making clear that as a deterrent, that there will be punishment and you can't face criminal charges for any sort of violence, whether that be on property or on individuals.
So let's talk about one of those leaders and a tweet from the president that Twitter flagged on the eve of the election. The president tweeting, "The Supreme Court decision on voting in Pennsylvania is a very dangerous one. It will allow rampant and unchecked cheating and will undermine our entire systems of laws. It'll also induce violence in the streets. Something must be done." This is now behind a warning on Twitter. What do you make of that?
I think the tech companies are going to have a pretty difficult job tonight and tomorrow and in the upcoming days, particularly if we don't have an outcome. I understand the tech companies are trying in good faith to take a lot of measures and actions in order to contain the flow of misinformation or inflammatory information. But at the end of the day, it's kind of on the public to make sure they're using good sources of information and that they're relying on government issued information about the election. And people are going to say all sorts of things online tonight and throughout the rest of the week. But I think that it would be best if everybody sort of takes a deep breath, sort of sits and waits. And the election is going to probably not come to a final outcome tonight. I'm not a pollster or a pundit, and I'm not an expert in election law, but I have a feeling that just based on tracking the mail-in ballots and the number of ballots that have come in terms of early voting, that we might not see an outcome. And what everyone needs to do is kind of make sure that during this time, we're not trying to instigate violence. We're not letting misinformation basically inflame and ignite a potentially volatile situation.
That feeling, Tara, is widely shared. I want to talk a little bit about the forces that we can't see. You heard from Homeland Security saying there's no evidence that foreign actors have interfered in this election, though we know over the last couple of years, Facebook, Twitter, for example, have been taking down accounts tied back to state actors. What can you tell us about the threat landscape domestically to interfere and from foreign actors to interfere online?
I think there are threats on both fronts. You saw that press conference, I believe it was last week, that last minute evening press conference with the DNI, John Radcliffe, and director of the FBI, Wray, and they basically came out and were pretty upfront about the foreign threat from both Iran, states like China and Russia. I think predominantly focused on Russia and Iran during this election cycle. Having said that, it's not just foreign actors that are trying to exploit divisions and trying to exploit the hyper-partisan, polarized environment. You have domestic extremist groups, you have anti-government groups, anarchist groups, from everything, violent elements of groups like Antifa, and then you also have white supremacist groups and right-wing militias. All of these actors are quite vocal in online forums, and the FBI has been tracking these, and there have been a number of threats that have been reported in the press. I mean, the most notable one, most high profile one was just against, obviously, the governor of Michigan, unrelated specifically to the election, but the election creates a perfect opportunity for people to exploit the uncertainty, the polarization, and basically a confluence of factors that we're seeing all come together in the next few weeks.